Welcome to Cookbook as Autobiography, or How to Read a Recipe. Today's presenter is Maureen Flanagan Battistella. She's a librarian by training and inclination, and now has a faculty appointment in the Sociology and Anthropology program at Southern Oregon University. Her research interests include culinary narrative, agricultural land use, and heritage preservation. She's the curator of the Stories of Southern Oregon project, published on YouTube and in the Southern Oregon Digital Archives at Southern Oregon University's Hannon Library. And today, we're good. And today we're going to learn about cookbooks and history and women's lives and how those stories are told. So I'm going to mute my own mic and hand this over to Maureen.
Well, welcome to everyone, and thank you, Ellie Anderson at the Ashland Public Library and the Jackson County Library Services for the opportunity today to share some of this research. It's Women's History Month, and today we're going to talk about some of my favorite topics: food and memory, and family and community. And this talk will show you how to make the most of your reading. And if you're a genealogist researching a woman's life, you may find some new rabbit holes to go down. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Okay, everybody got it? So I wonder how many of you have a vintage quilt in your home. Do you know who made it? Is it signed? Well, if you know who hand sewed that quilt, and even better, if a woman's name and the date she finished the quilt is stitched onto that cloth, you're so very, very fortunate. Because throughout history, domestic tasks, the work of home and hearth and family have gone unremarked, unrecognized, and unrecorded. A woman's culinary skill, her cooking, is similar in many ways to her quilting. Recipes are unsigned and undated. They're stained and worn with handwritten notes. Women's work and women's lives are often not part of the record. And so we have to look more closely and think differently about everyday objects in order to fill in some of that history. And a woman's recipes and cookbooks can help us do that. So recipes are clipped from the Sunday paper and from magazines, saved from the back of packages or manufacturers' giveaways. The collection of recipes tells a story about that woman, about her home and her family. The bits and pieces of paper that a woman saves tell us about the technologies and appliances she bought and when she bought them and how much money she could spend. They tell us about her favorite foods, the local produce that she had around her, or the imported food she could afford, and about her social group. Cookbooks describe women's daily rituals of domestic sustenance. They represent a collective understanding of food preparation technologies, and they give us clues to women's personalities, her heritage, and the community in which she lives. More than mere recipes, a community cookbook records the foodways that sustain the physical being and nourish the soul of that group. Maybe your church put together a cookbook, or maybe your colleagues at work did so. You can trace the history of a community through these cookbooks. And Ellie, you had a beautiful example of one earlier today that I hope you'll talk about later. So usually when I write or talk about food, it's from the molecular gastronomy perspective. That perspective is a very narrow and close look at something. And I pull it apart, I tease it apart to really look at the essence and the nature of that idea. But today, though, is going to be a smorgasbord, a buffet, or maybe a cereal dinner party with your neighbors, because these are the many ideas of culinary narrative. And by the end of the hour, I hope that you'll see your own culinary narrative in this story. Traditionally, the preparation of high food, or food for the wealthy and the royals, was the province of a chef, who was a man, but in the home, food preparation was a woman's task. She was a cook. The earliest written record of recipes were products of an oral tradition and the assumed knowledge passed on between generations. Practices were conveyed by experiential learning. You watched someone cook and learned how to do it. In the early 1900s, middle and upper class East Coast households still had servants, but more women were running their own homes. Female literacy was on the rise, and more women were preparing food for their families without the help of servants. So recipes, if you look through the path of recipes, you'll see that they're simpler and less ostentatious. Cookbooks had recipes for poultices and remedies and menus for the sick and cleaning instructions for the home. They were all-purpose instruments. The trend was even more evident on the West Coast as Americans surged west in search of gold and timber and land and open space. Recipes were for plain food, local goods prepared in a simple fashion. But as late as 1910 and 1920, ingredients were only generally listed and units of measure weren't standardized, like a good handful of flour, a knob of butter, a dash of salt, or 10 cents worth of curry. And wood stoves, which everybody used, had limited temperature control, so the recipe might stipulate a fast or a slow oven. And as you can see here, recipes were typically named for their ingredients, and yield was rarely mentioned. In 1931, Irma Rombauer changed everything with The Joy of Cooking. Recipes included both specific ingredients noted in the order of preparation with instructions that over time became standardized in more detail. Later, diagrams and illustrations and charts were added, along with chatty statements like excellent over salad greens or these gloriously messy old favorites. And you can trace the evolution of Rombauer's work and The Joy of Cooking's impact on our own cooking using Anne Mendelssohn's Stand Facing the Stove, the story of the women who gave America the joy of cooking. The Great Depression and then World War II brought scarcities, ersatz ingredients, substitutions, and after the war, new preservation methods and more modern refrigerators and appliances were all the rage. Haute cuisine, fine dining, and celebrity chefs were still largely the province of men, but Julia Child broke the mold with the French chef, simplifying complicated recipes and through television demonstrating techniques that could be easily managed in the home kitchen. Julia made it okay to make a mistake, okay to fail, okay to have fun. And essentially what she did was to elevate the preparation of food in the home into an art. Despite Julia's influence, foods became much more complicated as they were actually prepared by everyday people. They were complicated with cream sauces, all those a la kings, right? Elaborate jello molds, and people made canned food casseroles for their company dinners. We saw this in the 1950s cookbooks, and then we had a resurgence of bad taste in the 1980s, right? Teresa's smiling. But of course, you know, I'm skipping over decades and decades of food trends and movements, from tin cans to organic and sustainable and non-GMO, from low carbs to high fats, from Edna Lewis to Paula Deen, from Jamie Oliver to Gordon Ramsay, obesity and nutrition, the rise and fall of theme restaurants, and the popularity of global cuisines. But if you look closely at a recipe box or a cookbook, you can date the influences there through all of these trends. The Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements gained strength over the last 10 years, and it's increasingly influenced the media coverage and so the culinary narrative. In 2020, the New York Times reported that the James Beard Awards were on hiatus because of concerns about a lack of diversity and worries about a chef's behavior. NPR reported that Adam Rappaport, the editor-in-chief of Bon Appetit, stepped down after an undated photograph of him dressed in a racially insensitive costume surfaced, as well as accusations of discrimination and lack of inclusiveness at the magazine. But today, the culinary narrative speaks loudly against cultural appropriation, racial assumptions, and for ethnic cuisines, local foods, and women chefs. Now that's a very, very quick run through of how recipes can be read over the last 100 years or so. I'd like to turn to some examples of how cookbooks and recipes reflect a local and more personal tradition. As we go through the following case studies, look for these characteristics. Recipe structure, because how a recipe is organized can help you date the recipe. The assumed knowledge or what's not in the recipe can give you information about the relationship a woman would have had with others. Ingredients can help you date a recipe as well, and specific ingredients would suggest world experience or lack of, exposure to influences outside their own community, and wealth. Authorship can signify a formal position within the community or social group, and a woman's own pride in her cooking. An attribution and naming, for example, Aunt Sally's fried chicken, for example, can suggest the provenance of a recipe and the held respect for that woman's position and talent by others. And physical media is always something to think about, whether it's on recipe cards, clippings from newspapers, transcribed or typed recipes, or internet printouts. If a recipe is an expression of one woman, the distillation of one prepared food, then a community cookbook is an expression of the many women who have prepared it and a collective representation of those who have joined together to produce that work. The recipes in a community cookbook are an expression of a social group and all of the characteristics that define and describe that social group. After all, birds of a feather flock together, right? People work communally. So these are the three areas that I examine when I look at a community cookbook and that I would ask you to keep in mind: recipes, advertisements, and other facets. As far as recipes, we're looking at the distribution of recipes and the duplication. Is there a wide array of recipes within each category or each course? Are there many recipes for one food or one dessert? What is the composition or structure of that recipe? Who has authored it? Are the contributors named with their own name or their husband's name? And what sort of value statements are there in the recipe? For advertisements, you'd look at what the advertisements are for. And Ellie had a very nice example earlier of advertisements locally that showed in 1952 what businesses were actually in place here in Ashland. You can also categorize the frequency of a recipe, of an advertisement. How many recipes were there for groceries, for example, or lawyers, professional people? What's the language of that advertisement? Is it casual? Is it formal? Is it high-toned, or is it common language? So these are all things to think about when you're preparing, when you're looking at a recipe and at a cookbook. So the first case study I'd like to show you, all of these things happen by accident. I found 3 cookbooks in a short period of time from 1906, Boise, Idaho. 3 community cookbooks from 1906, Boise, Idaho. Right there, that told me a lot. There were 3 competing groups trying to make money with their cookbook, right? So using these 3 Boise, Idaho cookbooks published at the turn of the last century, I was able to see 3 distinct social groups and get an idea of the heritage, the values of each, the relative wealth, and world experience. I'm just curious, did you expect that from a cookbook? So the First Methodist Episcopal Church was one of the earliest founded in Boise. They were hardworking pioneer families. So the values that they showed in that cookbook indicated that they were cost conscious, economical. They looked for low prices, bottom line, and they were very, very thrifty. The meat and the vegetables that they had recipes for were locally sourced. You can see prairie chicken there, potatoes and suet. The Baptist cookbook was a product of the established middle class. You can see that they made quick breads instead of yeast rising breads. They used cheese so that they had some sort of augment to their food. They had recipes for rocks and gems, which are named sweets as opposed to a yellow cake or a dump cake. The foods they favored were traditional staples, but they had a twist. They were teachers and bankers and doctors who had the values of conservatism, trust, and quality. The Columbian Club really, though, was interesting. That one was 190 pages of high foods, fontanas, parfait, mousse, brandy, a la whatever, pate, risotto. And you think of the women that would have been involved in the Columbian exhibition in 1890, right, or 1885, whenever it was. These are women who went to the city, had great exposure to the world at large, and came home to cook with spices and named cheeses, tropical fruits, and alcohol. So wealth and prosperity, luxury and newness were all values that the women of the Columbian Club held. They were quality first, price almost was not even important. Things were not it wasn't important how cheap something was, but how good something was. They were after the luxury. And if they didn't have it, they aspired to it. Here's an example of how I looked at at advertisements. And I think if you look at these advertisements, you can kind of get an idea of the values that that these recipes or that these advertisements represented. One thing we know is that the advertisers for a particular community cookbook are usually related to the women that put together that cookbook. They may be husbands or family members, neighbors. And so what you're going to get is more of that birds of the feather flock together sort of thing. You're going to get that same social group communicating. And I love this one with 4 out of every 5 households in Boise cook with gas. The modern technology so pleases those who can afford it and have it, and tease those who don't. And look at the names that you find in a community cookbook. The Ladies' Aid Society of the First Baptist Church of Boise, Idaho in 1906. Suppose you had a friendship quilt with only the initials or the first names on the blocks that you could trace to Boise, Idaho. Don't you think a community cookbook would be a great place to look at some research for women's names who aren't elsewhere recorded? I'm going to jump a couple of decades here because this cookbook I found this year. I discovered the Soul Power cookbook and was immediately caught by all that the title implied. It was compiled by the students at the Ravenwood High School in East Palo Alto. So the Black Panther Party was founded in October 1966 in Oakland, California. just 3 years before this cookbook was compiled and just 30 miles away. The 1970 census for East Palo Alto shows that 60% of the population was African American. I've really wondered who those students were and where they came from. There was a home ec teacher who helped the students produce this cookbook. Her name was Joan Doyle, and she writes, "When schools began in the fall of 1969, I realized my job was to find a way to make my food courses meaningful. How could these young Black students become more involved? My students were excited when presented with the idea of a cookbook, and we wanted the recipes used by the great Black cooks of a generation or more ago and handed down from mother to daughter." Think of the defining characteristics of a community cookbook as you think of the recipes that I'll show you. What ingredients were used? How were they named? What was the attribution of that recipe? What value statements and commentary were associated with those recipes? Reading these recipes, we get a glimpse of who these students were and where they claimed heritage. It certainly wasn't East Palo Alto, California, but Oklahoma, Georgia, Texas, North Carolina. The taste of home is Southern by way of the Midwest. And I can't help thinking of the grapes of wrath and the great westward migration of the 20th century and the allure of the Golden State. The Soul Power Cookbook gave those students power. It acknowledged and legitimized their American heritage and their family's traditions with respect. I tried to contact Joan Doyle, and after phoning every Joan Doyle in the Bay Area that I could find, Sister Joan Doyle called me back and said she was a nun and not the teacher, but she wished me luck anyway. And maybe someday I'll find my Joan Doyle. So let's bring it a little bit closer to home. These Ashland cookbooks, and I certainly would have included yours, Ellie, if I had known of it. The Ashland cookbooks and recipe guides certainly tell the story of our town's culinary maturation. From Omar's toad in the hole advertising gimmick in 1942, the steakhouses and cafes of the 1960s, to the boutique restaurants of the 1990s, and today's Ashland is certainly a foodie's heaven. Study the OSF Tutor Guild's series of the Feast of Will cookbooks, and you'll find the Ashland chapter of the association, the American Association of University Women. Oh, and by the way, you can still get toad in the hole at Omar's. Cost a bit more than $1.60 now. Recently, actually about 2 weeks ago, I turned up a series of Jackson County 4-H cooking contest cookbooks edited by the Bunch family, who many of you probably know. They were published from 1999 through 2002. And here you can find an amazing record of culinary artistry in the youth. Melanie Bunch started a cooking club in high school, and her mom, Patty, was a 4-H leader. Patty Bunch reports that the kids had to come up with an original recipe, practice it with their family, keep a cooking journal, and then cook that recipe for the judges at the Jackson County Fair. The expectations were limited for the juniors, Patty said, but the seniors really had to wow the judges. Some of the recipes are fairly straightforward and use local fruits and vegetables, but others are more complex with many ingredients and many steps in the preparation. And what's exciting to think about from a research perspective is that in these cookbooks, you have biographical information about the contestants and often photos. And there'll be more records on these kids at the county extension office, along with more photos. And of course, because birds of a feather flock together, if you can track down one person, it's likely you can find the others. So you've got the same rabbit hole with any of these community cookbooks. So Antoinette Kuzmana Chatfield is the author of 5 cookbooks, and she's the wife of Oregon Governor Senator Mark Hatfield, first Oregon governor and then Senator Mark Hatfield. And Antoinette's cookbooks show how the wives of politicians use food to promote political position. I have to tell you that for 5 years, I wrote Antoinette. I wrote her every holiday. I wrote her every birthday, asking her to speak with me. And one day she called me back and I nearly fell on the floor. I was so excited. Her first cookbook was Remarkable Recipes. And you can see her husband's name there. It was Antoinette's testament to her husband. And there are some preferences to his preferences in the book, sweets and pickles, for example, though Mark himself admitted that he had fairly prosaic tastes. Now, if you read the cookbook closely, you can see who influenced Antoinette's choice of foods and recipes. Many recipes are easily extended for groups because her husband brought people home unexpectedly for lunch. They only lived a couple blocks from the Capitol. And there's a lot of family recipes referencing her Eastern European heritage. However, there are only a few appetizer recipes, as we do not believe in spoiling a good dinner with nibbles. We do not serve them, but it probably has more to do with the fact that Mark was Baptist and drinking was morally lax. The sections that have the most recipes in her first cookbook are those that feature sweets, because Antoinette actually held a weekly tea in her home during legislative sessions. Between 200 and 800 women would walk through that front door and walk out the back, each served tea and each served cookies. They came by the busloads. In 1966, Oregon sent Mark Hatfield to Congress, and Antoinette's second cookbook, More Remarkable Recipes, was published in 1971. And it fully reflected their glamorous life under Reagan or later under Reagan in the Capitol. Many recipes reflect the popular high fashion foods of the day, like souffles and couscous, papaya, artichokes, rarebit, and avocado. There were no family favorites, no low fashion foods like spam or hot dogs or hamburgers, no canned foods or Ritz crackers, and it's clear that Antoinette had expanded her culinary repertoire. Interestingly enough, in this cookbook, the recipes are from very influential people. Antoinette specifically invited those who could influence her publicity and her husband's reputation. So there are recipes from politicians like McGovern and Lady Bird Johnson, from celebrities like Van Cleburne, Dear Abby, and Philly Graham. But perhaps the most important contributors were food and fashion writers like Marion Burroughs from the Washington Post, Anne Reisman from Harper's Bazaar, and society columnists like Jeremy English in the Statesman Journal. They were Antoinette's publicity team, her machine. They pushed out news about Antoinette's cooking, Antoinette's dress, and by extension, her husband's position. Now, I don't know who of you know Porter Lombard or Corinne Lombard. They're a Medford family. I found Corinne Lombard's recipe collection, or at least part of it, at a family estate sale last year. Porter Lombard was an horticulturalist with the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center. He worked with the pear growers, and he was a major influence on the development of Southern Oregon's wine industry in the 70s. He's why we have wine here today. Porter had a home vineyard, and he made wine that he described as leathery, and it was very bad wine, actually. It was very tannic. Some of Corinne's recipes are printed on the back side of Porter's work files. And so we also have a record of Porter's work in the Jackson County Planning and Development offices. Look how stained that copy of the 1985 Jackson County Junior League Cookbook is. And there are dozens and dozens of recipes for Corinne Lombard's potato salad and her sweet and sour chicken wings. And these made me think that back in the day, Corinne and Porter entertained quite often. I had to laugh at the collection of classic 70s and 80s cheese fondue and cheese ball recipes. And I got a little teary-eyed at the collection of pear recipes, I have to say. Oddly enough, given her husband's vocation and avocation, I found no recipes with wine as an ingredient and no pairing notes. So COVID changed so much for so many of us. The shelves were stripped bare of toilet paper, bleach, and antiseptic wipes. We turned to beans as a shelf-stable protein. We stocked up on flour and baked bread for months, but there was no yeast to be found for much of that time. Food writers were locked into their studio apartments in the cities, and they started blogs about their family meals instead of writing restaurant reviews. On the other hand, the publishing industry exploded with new cookbooks and reprints of favorites. Kim Severson, if you'd like to read some more about this, writes about the experience in the New York Times article here. And she says, the books America cooked from during 2020 will stand as a cultural artifact of the year when a virus forced an entire nation into the kitchen. Everyday cooks went in search of new cuisines and projects to break up the routine. Some of Oregon's libraries accelerated their food literacy programs during the time of COVID. Our Jackson County Public Libraries organized cooking classes and take-home meal kits. Now they have a food pantry to help those who need food. Katie Meyer, pictured here, and others at the Oregon Historical Society had a hysterical time testing recipes from the 1800s, writing their tasting notes, sharing them, and blogging with their photos. I'm curious to know how COVID changed your food habits. How did cooking keep you sane during that time, or did it drive you crazy? I hope you've enjoyed this jaunt through the home kitchen of the last 200 years. It's time to bring it all full circle back to home. Take the time to read through your own family recipes, to learn more of your heritage, and study the community cookbooks you find, to understand how these cookbooks reflect their contributors. How many of you have a recipe file? This is mine, and I hope yours is better organized. How many of you have made sure that your recipes, your food traditions, can be preserved for the others in your family? Do you have your mother's and grandmother's recipes? And now, enough of me, because I want to hear from you. I want to hear about your mother's cooking, your cooking, and what you cooked in the time of COVID.
Well, I don't have a lot about my mother's recipes, but during COVID, OSF promoted a play. One of the actors was in Beirut or somewhere, and one was in New York City. It was a father and a son. The play was about a father and a son, and they're cooking the same meal in two different countries. And it's like a family tradition, right? It was a great play because they're dealing with all kinds of stuff about the death of the mother, the wife.
Ah,
Anyway, this was right during the heart of COVID when there wasn't a whole lot of going out or doing stuff. And I have a really good friend here in Ashland, and we decided to do that, to cook a meal together on Zoom. So we set our laptops up in our kitchen and we poured our Prosecco because we're not Baptist. And we cooked, and as we cooked, we talked, and it was great. It was a wonderful thing because I really love cooking with people and not being able to do that for all those months. But I said we're going to cook a signature dish, and then we're going to cook something we've never cooked. So anyway, it was a lot of fun. So that's I really had a lot of good times during COVID, and a lot of it involved cooking and
nice.
organizing my recipes.
I have a community cookbook to share. It's San Mateo District Italian Cookbook, 1974.
Perfect.
And it was given to me by my daughter's grandmother, who was 100% Italian. And she wrote in it, she said, this is December 25th, 1974. Kathy, I hope you enjoy cooking from this fine cookbook. This is one way of making you be Italian.
Yeah.
Which I'm not.
You know,
And the recipes are, here's a sample page. It's just, they're all pretty short. Can you see?
yeah.
And they're just real, Italian country, regular people recipes.
Yeah.
Like this one has polenta fritters. And here's veal scallopini with peppers. And there's a lot of food stains in here. So I have used it. It's quite a treasure for me.
Nice. I love the idea of ethnic cookbooks and how they represent immigration trends and population shifts in different areas. And I think that's another way to get at this idea of women's voices when they're not part of that public record. If they would have had an even tougher time of getting into the record than others. So thank you.
Last week, Facebook was showing me a number of Facebook memories from 2 years ago. And among those, 2 years ago, when I all of a sudden was staying home a whole lot. And one of those was a picture I took of I think 6 mason jars full of chicken soup that I made, because one of my coping strategies for feeling like, oh no, the world is coming to an end, was make lots of soup.
Yeah.
So I froze some of it and eventually wade through it. But I think that's an interesting, I'm going to batten down the hatches and make a lot of soup.
Chicken soup.
Specifically. I was also thinking about how people make notes in the margins of cookbooks, and don't actually put this much salt in, or makes this many when I'm doing it, or whatever. And I was noticing in this community cookbook that I was showing you before we started, Maureen,
Yeah.
which is Ashland's Treasures, and it's put together by the Royal Neighbors of America Society.
Royal Neighbors of America. You
Royal
got that?
Neighbors.
Never heard of it. Teresa, have you ever heard of that?
No.
I know.
No.
Well, this is the Royal Neighbor National Home in Rock Island, Illinois, apparently.
Wow.
Anyway, it's a big group of people with a lot of who put together this cookbook, and I was noticing there are notes in it, in this marginally, written in green pen, that sort of thing. But there are examples of the kinds of advertisements that Maureen was talking about.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I like this as patronize merchants advertised in this book. Do that. But yeah, lots of Ashland Poultry and Egg Mart, Ashland Cabinet Work.
What's the address for the poultry and egg mart?
It doesn't have an address. It says Ashland Poultry and Egg Market, Crater Lake Poultry and Egg Market. There's an Ashland location and a Medford location with, the Ashland has a phone number of 4041.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't say where it is,
Nice.
but it's, and the way that the recipes are written are things like watermelon pickles cut up in the usual way. Fun.
Yeah, Connie.
You talk about an employee cookbook. So this is one from 1999, and it was put together by the division that I managed. So there's a lot of contributors, including one fellow, and I still cook out of this. And it was laid out before desktop publishing and before, blurb and all that. This was just cut and paste into Word and everything with clip art. But anyway,
You
and there
remember
was,
how it was compiled? Did people get forced? Were recipes refused? Were they tested?
oh no, nothing was tested. I just asked everybody to give me their favorite Christmas recipes or their dessert recipes, sort of thing. And I just laid it out myself. This was a bonus recipe for Black Russian cake. It won the Christmas cooking contest in 1997. We used to have a lot of fun at this particular company, and every year I cook the trifle from this.
Oh,
You can see the little smear on the. So yeah, this is. I'm not a real sentimental person. I don't have kids to pass things on to, but this is definitely a cookbook they'll have to pry from my cold dead hands someday.
Yeah. I asked about testing. Those 3 Boise cookbooks I showed you, the Baptist or the Methodist was published first, and this is all kind of in the same year. The Methodist one was published first, the Baptist second, and Columbian was third. The Baptist cookbook was very clear that their recipes were tested. They had that in numerous locations, and it made me wonder about the Methodist cookbook, whether they were like missing elements or mistakes in that. Brenda, you had a cookbook? Do you have a cookbook?
Muted.
Okay. Yes, I do have a cookbook. I was born and raised in Honolulu,
Yeah.
and I used to have quite a collection of community cookbooks from Hawaii,
Oh,
but I've since moved several times. I've had to thin my cookbook collection, but I still have this one. I used to have several different versions of this. More of our favorite recipes, tested recipes from the island of Maui.
nice.
It's the Maui Extension Homemakers Council. And this says October 1967, but inside it says 7th edition, 1970.
Oh my gosh, that goes back a way.
Yeah, and it's comprised of university extension clubs, and it lists all the different clubs that were involved.
Wow.
And what's interesting too is there's a price sticker on the inside, Liberty House, $2.95. Liberty House is a big department store.
Ah,
So the fact that they got a community book for sale in the department store to me seems pretty
big news. Big news.
But what was really fun about Hawaiian recipes is that so many different ethnic groups represented. There's a lot of Japanese recipes, and then I flipped through and they had sour gratin, and there's whiskey cake, but there's a lot of Hawaiian fruit kebabs, pineapple canton, which is a Japanese gelatin. Chichi dango, I guess, is another Japanese Chinese. So it's but then there's snickerdoodle cookies, so corn butter cookies, coconut island cookies. So it's a real mishmash of different ethnic groups, and they're not segregated by ethnic group necessarily. They're just the usual, desserts and main dishes and whatnot. But anyway, these Hawaiian ethnic recipes cookbooks are really fun. So you can find these around sometimes.
I wish you had the whole series, because there's some really interesting things you can learn if you look at all 7 editions, for example. You can, because a cookbook can only have so many pages, right? So somebody's got to drop out and somebody's got to come in. So you can look at status and who's valued in that community. The other thing that's interesting, you can even do this with your collection. I have a collection of Joy of Cooking books, right? But you can trace through one recipe through each one of those editions, and you can see the change that's been influenced by technology or a different source of ingredients or spice. There's so much you can learn, and people just throw these things away, or they just keep the latest edition and don't think about it.
Yeah.
What do you think, Sarah? Sarah can't hear me. Hi, Sarah.
Well, Maureen, I don't have any community cookbooks really. This is Teresa.
Yeah.
But you're saying how you keep various editions.
Uh-huh.
I've done that with the ball canning books. I
Yeah.
have one that the first one that I bought, now I don't remember when, and every couple of years I'll buy a new one, but I can't bring myself to get rid of the old ones.
So what do you
And,
see in the change? How are they similar or different?
Well, I don't know exactly. What the one that's more recent is a lot fatter, so it has a lot more recipes in it. But yeah, but I'm always concerned about finding the one. They have a blueberry. I like preserving, and they have a blueberry jam recipe in there with lime that is terrific. And so I don't want to lose that recipe. It better still be in the new edition. But yeah. So I know recipes do get passed down in families, and that's very, quite something. So
Do y'all have recipe boxes like mine? What do your recipe boxes look like?
well, my recipe box is a lot more organized than yours.
Yeah.
But I forget that I have things in there,
Yeah.
to check. But certain things I know that I'll always find in there that I make. Yeah. So
I make one cake, the Clementine cake, and I, like you, I forget that I have that recipe. So I have like 10 copies of the Clementine cake in my box.
Well,
Yeah.
if we ordered a frozen quart,
Right.
and so I was bringing you the frozen quart, and then I couldn't remember if you ordered, because last week
I didn't order.
How about who else? Who else has a recipe box?
okay, because I'm leaving town tomorrow.
Oh, nice.
And
I don't have a recipe box. I keep mine in, I'm very anal retentive, so I got mine in binders, right? But I've got recipes that were handwritten by my grandmother. She died during COVID. She's about 102 when she died.
Wow.
Anyway, and as I cook the stuff, her recipes, my mother's recipes, even some of the recipes that I wrote out back in the 70s, I used to live overseas, and I'd write out recipes. It's like, I just go, wow, those, like that, they wrote that. You know what I mean? I mean, it's literally the ink and everything is their I recognize their penmanship.
The object.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to know what Joy of Cooking edition you all got. What cookbook did you get when you got married or when you left home? What was the standard go-to for when you kind of came of age?
Moosewood.
There was one that was a red and white checkered cover. I think it was Betty Crocker or
Yes,
Good
Betty
Housekeeping.
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know. I think my mother had that one. My mother was not a very good cook, so I don't have any of her recipes.
My mother is on this call, so I'm not commenting on my mother's cooking, except to say that it was very good. She's not hearing.
Of course.
One Christmas, my parents, who had been divorced for many years, both got me copies of the Tassajara bread book.
I've been to the Tassajara Hot Springs in Carmel Valley, California. Boy, that's a great place.
Oh,
That's fabulous food.
I don't have a recipe box, but I had, for a birthday one year, I bought a blank book and asked everyone who came to my birthday party to bring a recipe.
Oh, cool.
Which is, I recommend, because now this was years ago, and I can go back and I remember those people. I don't always cook all of their recipes, but some of them I do.
Was there wine involved?
Was there wine involved?
Because the recipes may not be very accurate.
There was a cookbook from the 40s and 50s, I think, because my husband has his mother's copy, and it was about 3 inches thick, and it was green. I don't know who did it. It was just called the Green Cookbook, and it has how to cook everything. They're Canadians. I don't think it was Canadian though, but there's a recipe in there on how to cook caribou and how to cook just beaver tail. I mean, seriously, everything you could imagine, it's in that cookbook. It's the second copy of it because the original copy from his mother's just falling apart. But so he found another one on eBay.
Well, I prepared a bibliography for you. I'm just going to share screen quickly here to show you. Can you see that okay? Yeah?
We can see your recipe box.
Okay, good. So, so these 1, 2, 3, 4, these 4 books I think are kind of fundamental to this idea of women's autobiography and how recipes reflect a woman's life, her daily life, her aspirations, her values, and they're really easy to read. This Thai baking as biography is very personal. It's about her mom. Recipes for Reading by Bauer is totally amazing because it's cookbooks. Floyd puts it a little bit more into an academic context, but the handout that Ellie is going to send you actually has a lot more because while these are sort of core to the idea, there are lots more, like the Jemima Code cookbook that came out this year about African American traditions in cookbooks. Also on the bibliography, there's a list of food movies because I couldn't resist sharing my favorite food movies with y'all. But it's been a wonderful hour. I so appreciate your time today. And what are you making for supper? Thank you, everybody.